In 1952, Annie Powell died at age 92 in this home in Lowell, Massachusetts, leaving behind thousands of glass plate negatives and prints. An immigrant from England, she only advertised herself as a commercial photographer in the early 1900s, and then as a studio partner with her husband. She didn't sign her work. She was forgotten to history and is buried in an unmarked grave. But exactly 5 years ago, I stumbled onto her legacy. I wrote a letter to the residents of this house where she died. Did they know anything about this beautiful photograph of a mill worker taken in the early 1900s? I discovered it on the University of Massachusetts Lowell website when I was producing a music video and needed an image. I became aware of the quiet power of the photo. It was at once beautiful and subversive, the way it challenged the brutal mill environment. A few days later, as I was resting from my first COVID shot, I got a phone call. "This is Bob Bacon," he said. "You wrote a letter to the house where I grew up, asking if I knew about old photographs?" I never expected a response, but here was the great-great-grandnephew of Annie Powell on the phone. And it's good I was already sitting when he continued. "At least in the early 1980s, he said, there were thousands of glass plate negatives and prints in the basement. And many of them," he said, "were of mill workers and mill buildings." Did I mention that this image I used was actually from a glass plate negative? In that moment, 5 years ago, I became an accidental photo historian. Ultimately, a champion for an unknown photographer I felt worthy of the world's attention. I wasn't professionally trained, but I grew up with a darkroom in our house and was a journalist for many years. My road ahead was strangely familiar, understanding darkroom tricks, investigating and reporting, only not about live people. In the ensuing years, I studied what remained of her final possessions, uncovered new source material, analyzed, and gathered stylistic and forensic evidence. I concluded that she took in the order of 5,000 unattributed or misattributed photos over 6 decades in Lowell. If we add in her commercial work in England, this makes her photographic career one of the longest in history. Her final possessions included about 85 images, but she also left the darkroom she apparently used beginning late 1923. It had become a laundry room, but some of the furnishings remain. This is one of her apothecary drawers used to hold the glass plate negatives. This could be her chair, her double basin sink, possibly her supply cabinet. The glass plate negatives were apparently sold to an antiques dealer in the 1980s. Oral histories of 3 family members and antiques dealer suggest a chain of custody of the mill girl image from here to the University of Massachusetts Lowell Library in 1989. Annie Powell was born Elizabeth Hannah Townend in 1859 in West Yorkshire, England. Her father was a farm laborer, and as a girl she worked in the local mill to support her family of 9. This photo was part of her final possessions. This would be a sister, and Powell about the age of 15. Please turn your attention to this black box. Incredibly, coming from an economically challenged family, she seems to have owned a box camera. Around 1881, she and husband John Powell opened a photo studio. Here is a carte de visite from that studio, donated to our project by a British collector and supporter. Facial recognition software suggests it's a self-portrait. If she is 31 here, that would plausibly make this an 1891 keepsake she left for her family as she was about to migrate to Lowell. She and her husband had a troubled marriage. Throughout her life, her career was independent, and here we can glimpse how early on she made this so. There were his and her portrait mounts. In John's version, the back stamp is an etching of a man painting a woman. Annie's is a woman painting a man. John's logo type spells out John, whereas hers uses the initial J, possibly as a woman of that time's way of obscuring a man's name. This is Annie Powell circa 1902, looking regal in her mid-40s. This was taken at the Lowell Textile School, which eventually became University of Massachusetts Lowell. And this is her on the left around 1951, when she would have been 92. She is in front of the house we saw in the opening photo. Let me point out her alertness and good posture. Taken with data from other sources, this helps us understand how she could have been an active documentary photographer at this time. The woman at the right is her younger sister, Clara Wood, then 80. She was the great-great-grandmother to the family member who called me after my COVID shot. Back to 1891, she traveled to Lowell ahead of her husband. In her new city, she quickly found work. Her sister and brother-in-law migrated there 4 years earlier and were established in the furniture business, so it's likely their connections helped. These children were not family members, yet their portrait was among her final possessions. So the photo she took for the Edmond Champagne studio must have had personal meaning. I think it was the start of a lifetime business of subcontracting for other studios, often brought in for her specialty, which was children's photos. This photo shows several traits that help define her work. One is her uncanny ability to draw out natural and relaxed expressions from even very young children. Another is expert placement of hands. I think in this case, the boy's hand helps composition and suggests connection to, possibly even protection for, his younger sister. Finally, if we take away the optical illusion of the positive and create a negative, we can see subtle retouching. For instance, a shadow that arcs. This violates the laws of physics. In fact, it's a different angle than this shadow on the front of the chair. So that's retouched as well. I think that the retouched shadows help connect the two subjects. I have seen many of her glass plate negatives. I have seen how she labored with chemicals and abrasives to create compelling images. Here are some other examples of her early work. On the right is a postcard featuring two of Powell's nieces. In recent years, it has been a popular poster sold online by a graphics house. One of the fun clues to Annie is the prevalence of British idioms in the souvenir books I associate with her. She seems to have provided the caption here in describing a bridge that survived an explosion. The bridge was not injured. Americans would reserve injured for living things and would have written the bridge was undamaged. As elsewhere, commercial studios in Lowell died in the early 1900s as Eastman Kodak put inexpensive cameras in family hands. She and her husband lost their studio to foreclosure in 1906. That was also the year that John was publicly accused of adultery, and the two separated for about 14 years. But Annie worked harder than ever. She had top-quality field equipment and the fortitude to brave New England weather to document municipal construction projects. She worked as a subcontractor, paid about 20 cents a photo in the 1920s, and took up to 28 photos a day. Here are 2 photos she took for the proprietors of Locks and Canals, the private corporation responsible for building and maintaining the water power that fueled the factories. She took photos for city engineers from the early 1900s to 1951, just 6 weeks before her death. The 2 project crews account for some 10,000 photos. A close look at the Lowell images shows that her long photographic career was in some ways hiding within the images. In this 1924 photo, let's enlarge a portion of the store window. It looks like a reflection of the photographer. I have found over 100 of these self-reflections, often showing a woman in a wide-brimmed hat. We have several cases where other photographers captured her on the job. Here's one of her walking away from her tripod and camera while documenting a gunpowder explosion in 1903. That's the same explosion where we saw earlier the bridge was uninjured. Finally, we have many cases where I believe she posed herself. This is my favorite, when she was 68 and looking pretty spry, crossing Bridge Street, maybe posed as a lawyer on the way to court. Let's compare her to the known photo of Powell in her early 90s. In spite of a 24-year difference in their ages, I see striking similarities between the 2 women. Slight height, erect posture, wiry frame, thin ankles, bulbous nose, wire-rimmed glasses, and clothing styles which include hats, shoes, and bags. Execution by hanging, the site of a suicide, mourning a brother with tuberculosis. It's easy to spot memento mori, reminders of death in Powell's work. I'll show an example. First, some background. As we see in this 1941 article, she was an active member of a revivalist church that believed God predetermines your time and place of death, and you must always be prepared. Sometimes it's hard to determine the story of her memento mori scenes, but in this case, there are some answers. In the window of the 1928 photo, it looks like it could be a reflection of a man in a noose. It's not our imagination. If we look carefully, we can see that it was carefully planned with a model. Almost certainly one of her assistants, a driver for the city engineers. Let's enlarge the print to see better. Also notice the figure walking by. Powell was fond of blurred, sometimes translucent figures, which I interpret as otherworldly people or agents of God. During that time, the front page was full of news about the abduction and brutal murder of a 12-year-old girl in Los Angeles. We see here several weeks after Powell's photo, "Hickman must hang for murder of Parker girl." I think Powell was playing this out in her art. When you become an accidental photo historian, what happens next? I can tell you what I did. I had fun making discoveries. I had fun collaborating with kindred spirits who know a lot. I felt compelled to spread the word and formed a nonprofit. We publish a weekly Substack newsletter. We have an ambitious 100 posters project. The posters are placed in the same spot where Powell took the images 100 years ago. The buildings where she photographed the mill worker in 1909 still stand, now apartments and offices. This photo shows a poster host getting ready to hang the image in a place which rhymes with history. As for Powell's final effects, we just got good news. Connecticut College, which was founded in 1911 as a women's college in New London, Connecticut, will be receiving the collection in the next few weeks.